judgment there.
You're listening to Head South Radio with your host, Kat Meyer, a podcast dedicated to prioritizing pleasure and removing the stigma and shame around sex. We're here to be curious and have an open conversation about sexual health and relational wellness. This podcast is intended for educational and entertainment purposes. The information discussed is not a substitute for professional medical advice.
Hi, Lena.
Hi, Kat.
I'm so glad we got to connect and talk. I would love to do a little icebreaker, quick little snip of getting to know who Lena is, and then we'll dive into the conversation.
Lovely.
So what fictional character do you have a crush on?
Oh my gosh, so many. I like to joke that one of my bisexual awakenings was the movie Pirates of the Caribbean. I had such a crush on both Orlando Bloom's character and Keira Knightley's. and also like the love that they shared and just kind of wanting to like be smashed in the middle of that. So I guess I'll go with that one. That's like the first one that comes to mind, but there's many others too.
That's actually a really great one. And I think a lot of people, myself included, felt the same way seeing that film and like having a crush on multiple characters of all genders within that film and being like, what is this? It's like, I want to be a part of that love story, but with everyone involved.
Totally.
What is your favorite time of day and why?
I didn't used to be a morning person, but I'm becoming more and more of a morning person. And I kind of like the quiet of morning. I have a little back deck that I like to sit on and drink my coffee, or sometimes the front porch, and just kind of like embracing a slow start to the morning.
Mm-hmm. Would you rather have the best sex of your life once or mediocre sex every day?
Ooh. Oh no. This one's cruel, Kat. Maybe the best sex of my life once, I think. And then maybe like also relying on that I could like recreate that in a solo way. If not in a partnered way. Yeah. Like I'd find a loophole.
Yeah, adding a little stipulation there.
Mm-hmm.
Would you rather shop for sex toys or lingerie?
Sex toys.
Would you rather have morning sex or late night sex?
Ooh, I love both. I think it depends on like the type of sex I'm wanting to have. Mm-hmm. I feel like morning sex can be a little bit more like vulnerable, if that makes sense. Whereas late night sex, at least in my sexual experiences, tends to like, offer for a bit more like kinky, wild experiences, which I love too. So I don't know if I have a preference. It would just depend on my mood for sure.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
So tell us about Lena, who you are, where you're from, and the work you do and the people you work with.
Okay. So yeah, I'm Lena. I use she, they pronouns. I am currently based in St. Louis, Missouri, but I am originally from Michigan. So I'm a Midwest gal through and through. And right now, I currently work for the Expansive Group, which is and I know you've interviewed some other of my colleagues from the Expansive Group, but essentially we're a diverse collective of sexuality professionals that provide queer-centered, pleasure-positive, anti-oppressive education and mental health services to primarily folks that are members of the LGBTQ plus community.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Yeah.
So then when we had our pre-conversation, which was actually at the beginning of summer, and it feels like yesterday and forever ago.
Yeah.
We discussed a few different topics of interest that you kind of feel very passionate about or have worked with explicitly with some of your clients. And one of the things that caught my attention was STI diagnosis and working through that with, do you call them patients, clients? How do you refer to the people you work with?
I guess like participants, I tend to work in more like group settings and workshop facilitation. So yeah, folks who are participating.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you're working with someone who's participating in a group setting, or even if they work with you one-on-one, how can someone navigate their emotions and fears around receiving a positive diagnosis of an STI?
Yeah, I mean, folks have a lot of ranging feelings and experiences when they're diagnosed with an STI, right? If it's their first time being diagnosed, it might feel really scary. It might feel like their sex life is over. It might feel, they might feel like really deeply depressed or ashamed. For folks who have maybe navigated multiple STI diagnoses, they might not have as much of those feelings. So just, wanted to say that there's like a whole range of feelings that can surround a positive diagnosis, and not all of them are bad, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I guess just like, the number one advice I would give to somebody who's in that place of navigating a positive diagnosis is just to like allow yourself to feel whatever you're feeling, to make sure that you're validating any of those feelings, knowing that there's no right or wrong way to feel about getting diagnosed with an STI. Allow yourself to be angry, to be sad, to be confused, to maybe just feel indifferent, and just like be where you're at. So yeah, first and foremost, that would definitely be one of my tips. And then in addition to that, just like knowing that you're not alone. STIs are pretty common. And, most people will have either, experienced having an STI in their lifetime or know somebody who has experienced that. So just know that you're not alone in your experience. You're not alone in the feelings that you're experiencing. There are people out there who, know where you're at right now and who can help you through this. And then I would definitely advise folks to, consult with a sex positive therapist, or asking any questions to a physician that you trust, and joining STI positive communities. Those can be a really great space for, navigating some of the more complicated, nuanced feelings around it.
And so what are some common misconceptions about STIs, and how can we challenge them to reduce stigma? So like what are some common things that you hear, or myths that you hear, or like, I mean, we've all been exposed to that. And there's also this, working around language of it's not a clean or dirty. Like when people, that's a big part of sex education now, is like when you're asking someone about it, it's not like, are you clean, is like definitely not the way to go in terms of STI and checking in with partners. So
Totally.
what do you come across when it comes to misconceptions, and how do you work through that with the people that you work with?
Yeah. I mean, that's a great one that you brought up right now. Just like being conscious of the language that we're using around how we're communicating about sexual health is a huge one. I think one of the biggest misconceptions around STIs is that people think that condoms can prevent all STIs, which is not the case, right? So condoms don't cover the entire genital region. So, if there's a situation where there's genitals involved that can even use a condom, there's still certain parts of the skin that are exposed that can leave us at risk for contracting STIs. And I don't say that to be scary. I know that a lot of this talk can like be scary, but just to so that folks have a realistic understanding of like the risk that they're engaging in. Also, when people think about using condoms as like the only preventative measure for STIs, that leaves out folks who are having vulva on vulva sex, where, condoms, at least in the form that they're intended to be used in, aren't really helpful, right? They can certainly be used. You can cut a condom up and create it and make it into a dental dam, and that can be used as a barrier method for folks with vulvas. But yeah, if there's areas of the skin that are exposed, condoms aren't going to protect you against everything.
Yeah, condoms essentially are protecting from penetrative, more often than not, penis in vagina, penis in the anal cavity. That's where it is relevant. Or using even like toys. So people don't talk about that as well, of like sharing toys with multiple partners and using condoms to protect, and also cleaning toys and things like that. But I think that's one of the misconceptions. I think also what you were referring to is like, you're like, I don't want to scare anybody, because that's how most of us receive, like that's the majority of sex education from what I kind of have surveyed from people, is a very big scare tactic, which then leads to shame when these things do happen. But I think coming from an informative place of like, here's all the information you need versus like, let me terrify you into actually, thinking that this is the solution, like a condom is the protective barrier. Or like, I think a lot of people assume oral sex isn't going to spread sexually transmitted diseases. But then to also counter that, there are like myths about things like using public toilets and contracting STIs. So do you have any thoughts on that, of like those kinds of myths or like wives' tales and how people
in terms of like how STIs are transmitted?
Yeah.
For sure. So most of the focus around STI prevention is around like HIV prevention. And I think, rightfully so, because there was an epidemic that the government ignored for years and years that predominantly affected queer and trans people. And so I think that it's good that there was like a lot of energy that went towards that prevention, but that prevention was typically around like sharing needles and preventing like fluid exchange with condoms, right? So there are certain STIs that can be transmitted via skin-to-skin contact. So when we say skin-to-skin, we mean genital-to-genital contact, mouth-to-genital contact, or mouth-to-mouth contact. So, you're not going to get an STI by like sitting on a toilet, right? Because that skin contact isn't happening. So that's maybe one helpful way of like, kind of navigating those like wives' tales, as you phrased it, right? Of like, is actual skin contact happening here? Or am I coming into contact with fluids that might be, be transmitting an STI?
In terms of support, so relational wellness is a very important aspect of Head South. And so it's not just about informing people who might have an STI diagnosis in this conversation. It's also about partners supporting, friends and family supporting, because I think that's the other thing, is that when you are diagnosed, maybe you do share it with a partner that you trust. But I love the idea of people listening to this podcast and feeling comfortable enough to open up that conversation with friends and family. So what is your advice for somebody who may not have been diagnosed, but they have a friend, a family member, a sibling who has been diagnosed? How can they support through that kind of stage of like learning, understanding, treatment, all of that? There is a process, back and forth with the doctors, kind of communication with former partners.
That's a great question. And I think it kind of leads to one of the other myths that I was thinking about around thinking that only STI positive people are responsible for disclosure. So like particularly in a situation where you're having sexual health conversations with a potential sexual partner, it's important for both people to disclose, right? No matter what your STI status is. And so one thing that friends and family of STI positive people can learn is that when they're going into their own sexual experiences, of realizing that like, oh, hey, I can help combat stigma by disclosing my status, whether it's positive or negative, as a way to start this conversation, right? So that's one way that, by having these conversations with friends and family, that other people then can kind of like pass on that, that knowledge of who's responsible for disclosure and those sorts of things. Another thing that I would advise, family and friends of STI positive folks is just to like thank them for telling you and thank them for having trust in you, asking them if they need any kind of support. So support might look like finding resources, healthcare, mental health care, for folks who may have an incurable STI that has really painful or uncomfortable symptoms. Like, what can I do when you're having an outbreak or a flare up? What can I do to support you during that time? Can I, bring you a yummy meal? Can I come over and watch a movie with you while you like lay in bed with a heating pad on, those sorts of things. And then obviously always reassure them that you're going to keep their health status private. Unfortunately, STIs are still like hugely stigmatized in our culture. So we want to make sure that we're doing our best to, respect our loved ones' wishes around who knows about their health status.
I love that. I appreciate that very much, because I feel like it is that walking a fine line of opening up the conversation, but then being a trustworthy, safe container for that conversation, which also includes like privacy.
Totally.
To your point, I wanted to acknowledge when you said, thanking them for sharing that information. It's something I've started to become very cognizant of. When someone tells me any sort of news that we can sometimes filter or project, like, I'm sorry. So when someone says, we broke up, for example, I am being very mindful of not saying I'm sorry as the immediate reaction, because then I feel like that projects onto the other person, like, this is bad news and I feel bad for you, versus thanking them for sharing that and how can I help? So it's like thank and ask versus I'm sorry. And our gut reaction often with bad news is to say, I'm sorry. But I think I love that like when someone discloses that information, instead of saying sorry, because then you're projecting this is bad. And sometimes it can feel scary and it can be bad, but it doesn't have to be as bad as we're projecting it out to be, if that makes any sense. It's like we can, when you offer gratitude for that information and then also offer ways in which you can be a support, how you can be helpful, I think is so powerful and empowering for the person that's sharing, because then it doesn't then start creating this narrative of like, there's something wrong with me. I feel bad, like feeling like a victim, feeling bad and shameful about it.
No, totally. It does. Because when we're projecting our own feelings potentially by assuming that somebody feels bad about their diagnosis, we might be reinforcing what they're already feeling. And, that's just, it's not helpful.
Let's take a quick break. Hey there. Allow me to introduce you to something that has completely transformed my body, the floss. The floss isn't just a trend, it's a movement method that has reshaped the way I approach my well-being. Imagine a subscription-based platform that offers you a key to unlocking your body's potential. Fascia flossing, as it's called, doesn't just scratch the surface, it remaps the fascia network of your body. Through a tailored blend of physical manipulation, guided resistance movement, and muscle elongation techniques, it's like giving your body a personalized renovation. Since adding the floss to my daily practice in 2019, I've experienced incredible improvements across the board. My mind-body connection is stronger than ever. And let's talk about the intimate aspects. Yes, it has boosted my sexual health connection too. You can hear more about that in the episode I recorded with the founder of the floss, Bonnie Krotzer. The floss supports all of my body systems, enhances mobility, offers prevention, and provides that active recovery we all need. Curious to learn more? Head over to thefloss.com, and if you use the code HEADSOUTH, HEADSOUTH, all caps, no spaces, you'll receive 50% off the first month. Let's get back to the podcast.
Can you share some strategies for building and maintaining healthy relationships after receiving a positive STI diagnosis? Because I know in that, like when you share this type of information, sometimes you'll get people who have a bad reaction or feel uncomfortable. And this can go for STIs and as well as other things in life. And so it's what I've been finding a lot with all of these conversations I've been having is it always distills down to communication. And so how can you build and maintain like a healthy strategy around that as the person with the diagnosis and like communicating and not feeling like if someone's like, I'm sorry, or someone reacts badly to the information. Maybe it's a former partner who their reaction is kind of scary or overwhelming. What types of boundaries and strategies do you suggest for people going through that process of like communicating their diagnosis?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking this question. I like to say that communication is one of the best safer sex practices. And, it's absolutely necessary for engaging in sexual encounters that make us feel, satisfied and pleasurable and safe and, connected. So one of the things that I would advise is disclosing your status to sexual partners for sure, whether that's current partners or future partners. And that can be scary. You don't know what somebody's reaction is going to be, right? So I like to suggest that folks have like a care plan for themselves before and after they disclose to somebody. So beforehand, it might look like pumping yourself up with some good music and like giving yourself a pep talk in the mirror, whatever that looks like to you. And maybe afterwards you have a plan to like connect with a friend or to go on a walk or to buy yourself a sweet treat or something afterwards, no matter if the conversation goes good or bad, just as like a little reward of like, hey, you just did this really hard thing that's really stigmatized in our culture, even though it shouldn't be, right?
Mm-hmm.
So make sure that you have that care plan in place for yourself so that you feel supported. Even if like the person on the other side of the conversation isn't supporting you, you know that you're showing up for yourself, right? And hopefully you have others in your community that can do the same for you.
Yeah. No, sorry. I just love that advice. And I think it's like, even that like having like a close friend or a confidant or even your current partner to be able to like call after that call, like a lifeline to be like, hey, I just want to ground myself in this. I don't want to talk about what happened, but just making sure that you line up the support that you need, whether it's a cookie or a friend or a walk or a bath. Those are like, I'm like, those are my go-tos. It's like walk, a nap, a bath, cookie.
Yeah.
Through like, and it does help. It does help like having that already lined up. And I love that it's not a reward because you got through the bad moment, and it's not a reward because it was a good conversation. It's just like, it's just available to support you. I think is so important.
Yeah.
And then you might not know the answer to this, but are there any legal considerations or obligations that someone should have to disclose their STI status?
Yeah. So there are actually, quite a few laws that exist that criminalize STI transmission across the United States. Most of them apply to like HIV specifically, some to STIs more broadly. And in some cases, people can even end up on the sex offender list if these laws are, followed through. I will add the caveat that most of these laws are not enforced just because it's really ambiguous. And there's a lot of problems around criminalization of STI transmission. Mm-hmm. For example, the laws often fail to figure out who may have had the STI first, right? So the person that might be, quote unquote, like accusing somebody of giving them an STI, they may have actually had that STI first. And because a lot of people don't know their status and they aren't tested regularly, it's hard to actually figure out who was the origin of an STI, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think that any sort of criminalization around these things is helpful anyways. But yeah, so that's just like something to consider. So there are considerations that you should maybe just keep in mind. I don't think, like just from like my personal politics, I don't think that, these legal consequences should be a motivator for you to be honest with your partners. But, if that's what it takes for you to have transparent conversations, then like I would encourage it. But yeah, be knowledgeable of what laws exist in the state that you reside for sure. And I think that like if we start combating the stigma around STIs and, normalize having these conversations, then these laws shouldn't need to exist.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
totally. I think normalizing these conversations is so important. I have one more question. Mm-hmm. It's to do with like the experience of someone, and I've heard this, I haven't experienced this, but I've heard this through other people in conversation of like someone cheating on their partner, and then it's discovered through an STI diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so for a person who goes through that and then maybe eventually goes through a breakup or a divorce, or there's a whole slew of other things that can, like the repercussions of something like that from an infidelity. So what is your take on that experience?
Yeah, for sure. It happens, and it's a really unfortunate experience for folks that it does happen to. I do want to first say, and to like add kind of a caveat, that if you're in a monogamous relationship with your partner and you end up contracting an STI, you should not jump to conclusions and assume that your partner has cheated on you. STIs can remain dormant for years. Most STIs are asymptomatic. So you may have actually had that STI and it didn't present until now. Your partner maybe had that STI and didn't know it before you were in a monogamous relationship. So just because somebody contracts an STI while in a monogamous relationship doesn't mean that one partner has cheated, right? Mm-hmm. That being said, it does happen, right? And it almost just feels like, the icing on top of a really shitty cake, where it's like, great, I have an STI and my partner cheated on me. This is like the perfect thing. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, again, just like I would advise those folks to like connect with community that helps you get through that hard time, both of those experiences. You might have different communities to help you navigate both of those problems, and that's okay too. I would say, to not demonize the person that gave you the STI for that reason, at least, and to not demonize the, if you know the person that they slept with, don't assume that it was them who gave them the STI. Don't be like spreading things about people's health statuses. Just trying to like remain as respectful and compassionate and like honoring the humanity of everybody that's involved in that situation, and acknowledging that we all have the power to hurt people, as uncomfortable as that is. In my opinion, like retaliation just won't help a situation like that. If anything, it'll just bring more pain and potentially more stigmatization.
Truly. I'm glad you added that caveat, because I will say, and I don't want to speak for like a medical generalization, but I believe in my own personal experience, I had been diagnosed with mononucleosis, like mono, the kissing disease, last year. And it was shortly, I had COVID in January and then a flu in February. And at the end of February, they tested me for everything because it was just like, I felt so terrible. And the doctor was like, you have mono. And I was like, what? And so to your point of like, that could have been dormant in me since junior high, high school, college, whatever it was, and completely came out of my system and was detectable at that point. And so I was like, I just have felt so weak. And it could be because of another virus releasing that into the body, or, affecting my immune system in a way that then kind of flares up everything. So I'm really glad that you shared that, because that is something I've heard amongst a lot of friends of having a diagnosis like that and being like, I haven't slept with anybody. I have like all of a sudden a cold sore, which is a cold sore is a form of herpes.
Yeah.
And it turns out that it was something that like they, contracted when they're in kindergarten, eating crayons. And like we carry these things in our bodies.
Yeah, that's another misconception around STIs, is that all STIs are transmitted sexually. That's not necessarily, I mean, it stands for sexually transmitted infection, but like that's not necessarily the case, right? Somebody can get a cold sore, which is HSV1, a form of oral herpes. You can get that from like kissing a family member who might have a cold sore, or, like these really like more like family moments that aren't necessarily sexual. And then you grow up and you have that virus in your system, right? Because there's no cure for HSV at this time, at least. And then, oral herpes or cold sores can transmit genitally or orally to another person. So, what may have started, the origin isn't always sexual. So that's another reason why, this stigma is so harmful and why we have to be cautious of it, is because we don't know where these things came from in a lot of cases. And we shouldn't make assumptions about what it means to have an STI as if that means anything about you other than that you might be sexually active.
You might. And that's
all it means. That's all it means. It doesn't mean anything about your morality, about your worth, about your sexual practices. You can do everything, quote unquote, right when it comes to safer sex, and you can still contract an STI. And that's okay. That's okay.
Thank you. I think that's a perfect place to close, is on that. Like, it is okay. And I love that, like, you're like, to clarify that, like, this, it means nothing in terms of who you are as a human being at all.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is there anything, Lena, that you would like to close with? Anything that we missed that you'd like to share?
I think we can close here. I mean, if you're open at a later time to having a part 2, I think that there's a few things that maybe we could expand on even further.
Absolutely. Yeah, I would love to schedule in a part 2 and continue, because I have a feeling this episode and this information will kind of trigger more questions. And so I actually would love to have a part 2 where we can open up the conversation and kind of source some questions people might have, and also expand on other areas, because I know that this is not just the only thing that you focus on in your work. So I'd love to continue the conversation with you and the work you're doing with Expansive Group. How do people find you?
Yeah, you can find me at my website, lenapeak, lenapeak.com. And then my email and all my other information is attached from there.
Cool. Perfect. Thanks, Lena.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Special thanks to all of our guests. Head South is hosted by Kat Meyer, produced by Isis Barlow, edited by Megan Hook, with music by Lily Rezi Rothman, graphics by Ella Chodos Irvine, cover art by Gina Ship Casey, and intro by Murph Meyer.
Come on, look me right in the